The pounding of the gavel couldn't drown out the filthy shout. "Black women like you should know their place." Briggs stepped forward, the shiny sheriff's badge on his chest gleaming like a weapon, deliberately trying to humiliate her under hundreds of eyes. Alicia didn't flinch, her stare cold as steel, which only fueled his rage. "I've swept 3 like you out of the system, and you'll be the 4th. Then came the brutal kick, sharp and loud, and the courtroom exploded into a war zone. The courtroom blazed with harsh lights, the high ceiling cold and distant, each fluorescent bulb casting a pale white glow that made the skin look even more ashen. Rows of hard wooden benches were lined up tightly without a single gap, every seat taken by a crowd of all ages, from curious young lawyers to ordinary citizens eager to witness a trial that had been the subject of heated rumors for days. On the raised bench, the judge sat silently face, trying to project authority, though a trace of tension flickered at the corners of his eyes as he too could feel the strange weight hanging over the room. The air was thick, like an oncoming storm, so heavy that each breath sounded like a stifled sob, and every small shift on the benches echoed like a drumbeat. In the middle of that charged silence, Sheriff Dalton Briggs rose. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his cold eyes sweeping across the room like a blade at the throat of every person present. He moved as if this were his own territory, each boot step pounding the wooden floor with a thud that declared his power as something untouchable. His gaze finally landed on a woman seated below her posture, straight hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes calm but far from meek. This was Alicia Moore, the black woman whom most people in that courtroom saw as nothing more than an ordinary witness. Briggs clenched his jaw, tendons bulging, then suddenly spoke, his voice firm and laced with venom, every word like a blade made of spit and steel. "Skin-colored parasite, this place isn't for your kind." The words cut through the dense air, making it feel like the temperature in the room dropped a few more degrees. A few heads turned, some people flinched. Someone drew in a sharp breath and looked away, afraid Briggs's gaze might land on them. That tone of disgust seeped into every corner, into every ear, cracking the tension further. A young woman in the back row began to breathe shallowly, and an elderly lawyer pressed his lips into a hard line as if to object, but stopped himself, knowing full well that at this moment any word of protest would be crushed instantly. Alicia didn't move. Her face didn't flinch, didn't offer even a forced smile. It remained perfectly still. But her eyes, those eyes were different. They burned dark and sharp, like a blade pointed directly at the man trying to degrade her. Her silence, instead of giving Briggs the upper hand, became a slow, simmering flame that made him increasingly agitated with every passing second. Those around them started to shift, some fidgeting on their benches, others glancing around as if everyone was collectively waiting for something to explode. Someone whispered a prayer, soft as wind, but enough to show the tension had reached a point beyond normal endurance. Briggs could no longer hold back. Alicia's unblinking stare seemed to peel away the hollowness inside the authority he had always leaned on. In a sudden burst, Briggs lunged toward her. The pounding of his leather shoes echoed through the room, bouncing off every wall, evoking the image of a predator charging its chosen prey. The packed courtroom turned into a vast, chilling void, every eye locked onto his advancing steps. Then, without warning, his leg swung high, the motion sharp, brutal, and merciless, delivering a direct kick aimed at Alicia's stomach. The strike happened so fast that many didn't even have time to blink. It wasn't random. This was an assault fueled by hatred, arrogance, and a thirst for destruction. When his foot struck Alicia's body, the impact rang out crisp and hollow like a blow against metal. The courtroom exploded, screams bursting from every direction, chairs scraping, people gasping for breath, all merging into a fierce storm of chaos. Some stood with hands over their mouths in horror, others ducked to avoid the glare of the man in power, and a few trembling hands fumbled for phones but were too shaken to hit record. The judge pounded his gavel again and again, the sound echoing like a futile beat beneath the storm that had just erupted. In that instant, the image of a white police officer kicking a black woman in the middle of a courtroom burned itself into everyone's memory. No one could erase it, no matter how much they might later wish to forget. The air froze in the aftermath, as if the entire world were holding its breath. Briggs stood tall, chest heaving with satisfaction, eyes gleaming with pride, like a beast that had claimed its victory, framed by the stunned, horrified gazes of the crowd. Alicia leaned slightly forward, her hands tightening, face still eerily calm, but inside every vein surged as if to remind her the real storm had only just begun. A man, seated in the back row, clutched his head and whispered that he never thought he'd witness something like this in his life. A young woman cried, mumbling that justice had taken on a cruel face. Others turned to each other, murmuring incomplete sentences, too shaken to fully grasp the reality unfolding before them. Meanwhile, Briggs remained smug, as if the kick he delivered was a sentence passed on everyone, a declaration that Alicia's skin and gender were powerless against the shadow of his authority. Yet her silence and the unshaken resolve in her eyes added more than a few realized that real power was cracking at its core right in the moment he thought he had won. The echo of the kick, the panicked breathing, and the relentless pounding of the gavel all blended into a chaotic symphony. The room was no longer a courtroom but a battlefield where the law had been trampled by the very man sworn to uphold it. In the midst of the chaos, everyone understood this was only the beginning, that the fight was far from over, and that Alicia's unflinching eyes, shining cold through the storm, would be the flame no storm could extinguish. Briggs's kick sent a jolt through the room. Alicia collapsed her body, folding briefly. The dry thud of her hit in the wooden floor, making several people squeeze their eyes shut. But before pity had the chance to rise in anyone's chest, she planted her hands down, took a deep breath, and pushed herself up with force. Her posture was perfectly upright, as if untouched, eyes wide and blazing, staring straight ahead. Her fall was so brief it resembled a purposeful drop to one knee before a powerful stand, silencing the entire room in an instant. The eyes that had expected a trembling, tearful woman now witnessed calm resilience, and that contrast only deepened the weight in the air. In that moment, it felt as though she stood not just for herself, but for a community long trampled beneath power. Briggs watched the scene, the corner of his mouth curling into a sneer. He reached up and slapped the gleaming gold sheriff's badge on his chest, the sound loud as if it carried absolute authority. "I am the law here." His voice hit each word with pride and arrogance. To Briggs, that badge was a free pass for any act to shield against all judgment. He felt triumphant, convinced his kick had shown the entire courtroom that the law lived in his hands and that anyone who dared stand against him would be crushed. But he didn't see that the very moment he beat his chest in pride, the first crack formed in the crowd's trust, as everyone could now see the stark contrast between that shining badge and the brutality it had just condoned. An older woman in the back row covered her mouth, eyes wet with tears. She whispered to the person beside her, voice trembling with fury, "My God, he did that right here in court?" The whisper was soft but rang through like a knife slicing into everyone's thoughts. Because the truth was undeniable, a white police officer had used violence against a black woman in the very place meant to symbolize justice. Everyone heard it. No one disagreed, because deep down they all shared the same thought. They had just never dared to say it. The old woman's words struck like a bell, and many eyes began to shift. They no longer saw Alicia as a nameless witness, but as a person standing up in the face of raw violence. Alicia turned, eyes locked on Briggs. Her voice rang out low and cold like wind slicing through a mountain pass, each word falling like a stone aimed straight at his pride. "The law doesn't belong to the man who kicks a woman." The sentence cut through the suffocating air, spreading like a ripple, forcing many to swallow hard. It was simple, but weighty, stripping the bluff from Briggs's bold claim. From the gallery, a few nodded subtly, some clenched their fists, and others whispered in agreement. A quiet current stirred word, not loud, not violent, but strong enough for Briggs to feel his footing was no longer firm. The room filled with murmurs, a chorus of voices tumbling like steady rain. Some leaned in to whisper, others shifted to see more clearly, all eyes drawn to the two figures facing each other at the center. In those gazes was a tug of war between fear and fury, between caution and the desire to speak truth. No one denied Briggs's power, but now no one could deny Alicia's defiance. Her upright stance, unwavering eyes, and sharp, steady words planted in many the belief that justice still existed somewhere, even when buried. Briggs pressed his lips together, his sneer faltering. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially in public. Alicia's calm didn't please him. It stripped away a power he thought unquestioned. The kick meant to break her had instead ignited a stronger fire. His jaw tightened, veins rising in his neck, eyes wild with anger, but in the storm of whispers he couldn't lash out again so easily. From the bench, the judge banged his gavel several more times, his voice straining to push back the chaos. But the sound only underscored his helplessness because the courtroom was no longer a space for dry procedure. It had become a battlefield of words where every sentence, every glance could shift the ground. Lawyers, court staff, and reporters scattered throughout held their breath, aware they were witnessing a moment that could mark history. A cold draft slipped through the door, carrying the scent of coming rain, mingled with damp wood and the pent-up sweat of hundreds, making the air even heavier. In that weight, Alicia stood like an unmoving pillar facing the man who held the power to harm her, now the absolute center of the room. Each breath she took, each small movement, pounded like a drumbeat in the minds of those watching, forcing them to confront the question: who truly holds justice, the one with the badge or the one who was kicked down and still stood up? Outside the towering window frame, the sky was gray, and heavy clouds gathering distant thunder, rolling in like the sound of war drums. Inside, the real storm had already broken loose in the heart of the courtroom, not with wind or rain, but with stares, with words, with a kick, and with the rising of a woman. Alicia did not tremble, did not retreat. She stood firm, cold, and sharp. Her words still echoed in everyone's mind. The law doesn't belong to the man who kicks a woman. It had become a red thread stretched across the room from the gallery to the judge's bench, from furious hearts to those pressing their lips in restraint, making it clear to all that this battle was only just beginning. Alicia stood in the center of the restless courtroom like a statue, cast in blackened bronze, but her left hand almost unconsciously tightened slightly and rose to touch her right wrist. There, a long, jagged scar, faded by time, still marked her skin, an old wound etched deep as a witness to a past she never wanted to remember but could never forget. The pale, white light from the ceiling shone down, making the scar more visible, like a dry crack across land worn bare by storm after storm. Others might have seen it as a minor detail, but to Alicia it was a living memory of years crushed under injustice, the trace of wrongs that had once ruled her life. The courtroom began to recede in her mind, giving way to a distant memory. Years ago, on a quiet suburban road, she was driving home after a grueling military training session. Her car stopped as flashing red and blue lights flared behind her, followed by the sharp wail of sirens. As she lowered her window before she could speak a curt command, barked out, ordering her to step out and turn around. She hadn't yet shown her ID, hadn't had a chance to explain she was a military officer returning from extended training before her arm was yanked behind her back and the cold bite of metal clamped tight around her wrist. The click of the cuffs echoed with a brutal finality, each snap cutting into her like a blade. The pain surged, bringing her to her knees, sweat breaking across her forehead, but worse than the physical shock was the sound of laughter behind her. A young officer, hair bleach blonde voice dripping with mockery. "Don't think a uniform makes you clean." That sentence carved into her bones. Not because it was true, but because it exposed a deeper reality to them. Her skin color was a permanent stain on no service or sacrifice could ever wash away. Thrown into the back of the car, her head struck the steel frame, and in the flat, blank stares of the officers, she saw clearly that her truth and her honor meant nothing in the face of prejudice. As the memory surged back, Alicia felt a fresh sting in her wrist, as if her skin still remembered the pressure of each metal ring. She drew in a breath, her chest rising in the storm of the courtroom, her hand still resting on the scar like a silent reminder. The dull ache wasn't just physical, it rang like a bell inside her, marking the beat of resolve, affirming that today could not be a repeat of that day. Back then, she had swallowed humiliation to survive, had stayed silent just to be released. But now, under hundreds of eyes, she could not allow that silence to return. Her heart pounded with the rhythm of battle drums, reminding her this was the moment to stand tall, to show the world that justice does not die when fear is cast aside. In the crowd, no one knew about the scar, but Briggs saw it. His eyes flicked to her hand resting on her wrist, and a crooked, cruel smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who had just spotted an old wound on his prey. He tilted his head, voice lowered, but cutting through the silence. "That scar proves you were born to crawl." Each word dripped like acid, filled with contempt and delight. To him, a scar wasn't just a mark, it was a life sentence stamped onto someone's identity. He wanted the crowd to look at it and believe Alicia was weak once broken, and forever stuck in the mud of their assumptions. But Briggs was wrong. Alicia didn't lower her head or turn away. She stood tall, shoulders squared, chin high, her eyes slicing into the space ahead like a sharpened blade. Her silence wasn't submission, it was defiance. Her gaze burned so bright it sent a chill through the room, as if anyone who met her eyes saw themselves exposed. In that instant, her silence became power, a declaration louder than any shout. Across the courtroom, from spectators to staff, people began to feel the strange force radiating from Alicia's stance. Whispers began to ripple, hushed voices passing between rows, but no one dared speak aloud. A young lawyer lowered his head to take notes, his hand trembling. A young mother hugged her child close and gave a faint nod after hearing Briggs's venom. Everyone saw the contrast. On one side, power flaunted with cruelty. On the other, silent strength shaking the room. Briggs had hoped his insult would crush Alicia, but instead he had exposed himself. The air inside the courtroom had shifted. No one spoke up yet, but eyes were changing. Some stared at Briggs with tightly coiled fury. Others looked at Alicia with a mix of awe and disbelief. Every breath felt heavier as all watched an uneven battle unfold with raw intensity. In that space, the scar no longer symbolized shame. It had become a mark of endurance, like a slash across a sword that still gleamed after every war. Outside, the sky had darkened, clouds hanging thick and low, distant thunder making the window panes tremble. Inside, no one heard the rain, but everyone knew the real storm was happening here right now. Alicia remained silent, but that silence had become a weapon, forcing Briggs to realize he no longer held full control. The woman he thought would crumble over an old scar now stood upright, unshaken, and that strength echoed back at him, pressing down on his chest like the weight of a stone. Briggs tried to hold his sneer, but the corner of his mouth twitched. Those closest to him saw the shift clearly even as he kept up his arrogant front, and Alicia, with eyes sharp as a blade, had turned the scar into a silent response, pushing him back inwardly though no physical step was taken. The truth had filled the room, no shouting, no noise, only a scar, a gaze, and a woman standing tall. The courtroom door closed, the heavy wood echoing briefly before fading into silence. The long hallway, lined with dark, worn carpet, sat under dim yellow lights that failed to chase away the blotches of shadow along the wall. The sound of the departing crowd's footsteps drifted farther away, leaving only the slow, heavy echoes that seemed to press inward on the chest. Alicia walked calmly, her breath steady posture straight like an arrow flying through the dark. Each footfall struck the tile with a cold, measured beat, joining the rhythm of rain just beginning to tap against the glass outside, forming a somber harmony. Briggs appeared at the far end of the hall, his shadow stretching across the damp tile. He walked forward slowly, his face still bearing the weight of bitterness from the courtroom. When only a few meters remained between them, he stopped blocking her path, his sharp gaze fixed on Alicia like a blade testing her resolve. His voice dropped low and hard. "You're just a colored pawn. I've taken down 3 like you in training camp." The words filled the hallway, bouncing off the walls, sinking into the listener's chest, soaked in contempt. For Briggs, it was a warning and a boast, his declaration that he had the right to erase anyone, especially a black woman bold enough to challenge his rule. Alicia stopped in front of him, her eyes still carrying the same cold intensity that had unsettled the courtroom. She didn't back away or look for another path. She stepped forward. That single step closed the distance enough for Briggs to feel the force in her presence, enough to make him instinctively shift half a step back. It wasn't strength of body that moved him, but the pressure in her gaze like a mirror reflecting the cowardice beneath his armor of authority. Briggs froze, fist clenched, trying to hold his arrogant stance, but the unconscious retreat left him unsteady. Fast, sharp footsteps echoed from down the corridor. A young clerk, thin and carrying a stack of files, came running. As he approached, he saw Alicia and Briggs facing off, the air between them dense, ready to erupt. His eyes widened, arms tightening around the documents, clearly considering whether to interrupt. But Briggs turned his stare, flashing cold, and snapped out. "This is above your level." The command rattled the hallway, and the clerk immediately lowered his head, hurrying past as if fleeing. Papers in his arms trembled, a few falling to the floor, but he didn't stop to pick them up. His shadow stretched across the floor and disappeared around the corner, leaving behind a silence that pressed in like a held breath. In that moment, Alicia held her gaze steady, unmoving, unshaken. As Briggs turned back, ready to throw out more insults, she spoke. Her voice came out evenly, not loud but clear, every word firm and final, like a verdict. "This isn't about rank. This is about honor." The words echoed down the hallway, striking the stained walls and bouncing back a declaration carved into stone. No one else was there to hear it but Briggs, yet the presence of those words alone threw him off balance. Briggs narrowed his eyes, his face flushing red with anger. He was used to lowered glances, turned heads, and empty yes sirs. He had never imagined someone would stand upright, would hurl back a sentence so cold and sharp it struck like a hammer. He stepped forward, boot pressing hard into the carpet, trying to reclaim dominance. But Alicia's gaze didn't shift. Calmness tightened his chest like a stone, pressing against his ribs. The hallway remained dim yellow light, casting the shadows of 2 figures facing off, one arrogant, one unshaken. Outside, the rain grew heavier, the scent of mildew creeping in through a cracked window, thickening the air. The rhythm of the rain matched Alicia's heartbeat, each drop like a pounding drum, reminding her that every step she held firm today was a reclamation of what the past had stolen. Briggs, in his anger, didn't realize he was already losing the silent war. Every word he threw was deflected not by speeches, but by Alicia's solid presence. The space between them now felt like the border of 2 worlds. On one side, a hollow power clinging to a badge; on the other, real honor forged from pride and pain. Alicia knew that if she stepped back, she'd give the scar of the past another mark. But if she stood still, quiet and unyielding, Briggs would be the one exposed, and reality was proving it because every breath he took, every twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed the unease he couldn't hide. Time slowed, each second dragging like a minute, each minute stretching into an hour. But in that tension, Alicia felt no fear, only clarity like lightning flashing across a dark sky. The words she had spoken weren't just for Briggs, but for herself, for everyone who had ever been humiliated or dismissed. Honor, the word echoed through her mind, becoming a light in the dark hallway, shining on Briggs's flushed face and lighting the path she would continue to walk. In Alicia's unwavering gaze, Briggs saw himself, saw the cracks he had long tried to cover with arrogance and authority. He suddenly realized that honor wasn't in the badge he wore, but in whether he had the courage to face the truth. But he couldn't admit that because his whole life had been built on others' fear, on enforcing control through force. He pressed his lips together, his hand trembling slightly, and stayed silent. His silence, unlike Alicia's, shifted the balance in that hallway. One was the silence of someone losing ground, the other the silence of someone who had already won. And from that moment on, Briggs began to understand that the game he thought he controlled was no longer his. When Briggs stepped out of the dark hallway and returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had dipped a notch. People were still whispering about the earlier kick and the insult he had hurled at Alicia, though no one dared to speak openly. The judge sat upright, his face more stern, the wooden gavel placed close at hand, ready to strike at the slightest disruption. But whispers still slipped between the rows, thin as wind, sneaking through a window, making the silence feel even heavier. Briggs walked to the witness stand, his broad frame blocking part of the light behind him, casting a long shadow across the pale wooden floor. His leather shoes hit the ground with stiff, dry thuds, each step a reminder that he still believed he held control. He lifted his chin, slapped the gold sheriff's badge on his chest, then turned his gaze toward the public seats. His cold eyes went straight to Alicia, locking on her as if no one else existed. That stare lingered part challenge, part threat, enough to send a chill down the backs of those watching. As questioning began, Briggs didn't respond immediately. He waited until the room fell silent, then let out a twisted smile. His voice rang out loud and coarse, each word like a hammer blow against stone. Justice doesn't need the tears of black women. The sound shot through the air, embedding itself deep in everyone's mind, sending a fresh shock through the already heavy room. Someone's mouth fell open. Someone else clenched their hands white on their knees. The sentence landed like cold water to the face, exposing the raw truth that even here in a courtroom supposedly built to shelter fairness, bias, and contempt still stood tall. Alicia stayed still, eyes wide, taking a deep breath. From deep in memory, the cold steel cuffs, the mocking voices came rushing back, but this time they didn't bring her down, they gave her strength. She slowly rose, the wooden bench creaking beneath her, marking the moment. Every eye snapped to her, and for a heartbeat the room seemed to stop breathing. When she spoke, her voice was low but clear, firm as steel, not loud but sharp enough for every word to reach every corner. Justice only needs truth, not those who twist it. Her words dropped into the courtroom like a stone, sending ripples outward. Eyes began to light up, a few heads nodded, whispers rose with emotion. A young woman clutched the hand of the person beside her, tears brimming in her eyes. Alicia's words weren't long, didn't aim for eloquence, but they stripped the mask off Briggs's smug smile and made it plain: justice doesn't belong to the one who invokes it to feed himself. Briggs froze for a moment. He wasn't used to defiance, especially not public defiance in front of everyone. The sneer on his lips quickly twisted into rage. His mouth clamped shut, chest rising and falling, veins bulging at his temples. He no longer cared about saving face or following procedure. He only wanted to crush his opponent. In a flash of lost control, Briggs slammed his hand on the witness stand and lunged forward. His shoes pounded against the floor in rapid succession, echoing like war drums jolting the room. room. The crowd jumped to its feet, cries ringing out. Someone screamed, chairs scraped and toppled in the chaos. But it all happened too fast for anyone to stop him. Briggs charged straight at Alicia, arm extended as if to shove her down in front of hundreds of eyes. In that moment, space seemed to contract, time slowed, and every blink stretched endlessly. But Alicia didn't back down. Her eyes locked onto him, her body angled slightly, and her right hand clenched into a fist. The punch flew clean and deliberate, so precise that no one could believe it would actually land. The impact cracked through the room like thunder, sharp and undeniable. Briggs staggered his massive frame, reeling arms flailing like grasping at air. One cheek flushed red, his eyes wide in shock, and he stumbled back several steps, nearly collapsing to the floor. In that instant, the room erupted. Screams mixed with gasps, voices rising in a crashing wave of noise. Some clutched their heads, others covered their mouths, while eyes around the room lit up stunned, then gleaming with a fierce unspoken thrill. The judge pounded his gavel again and again, his face stricken, but the strikes were lost beneath the roar. Court officers rushed forward, yet none dared to lay a hand on Alicia. Her upright stance, fist still charged with power, eyes locked on Briggs, drew every gaze in the room. Briggs stood still, one hand pressed to his burning cheek, eyes dazed. He had never been treated this way, never imagined the woman he tried to humiliate would fight back in front of everyone. His arrogance shattered the shell of authority ripped open by a single punch. The crowd no longer looked at him with fear, but with judgment. And in those eyes, Briggs understood that everything had changed, that from this moment on he was no longer the law in this room. Alicia's punch didn't just make Briggs stagger, it shook the entire system. The shouts, the sharp breaths, the rush of voices turned the courtroom into an arena where justice was no longer decided by the man with the badge, but by the force of truth. And as Briggs still swayed, struggling to stay upright, the image of Alicia standing firm, eyes blazing, had already become a symbol for everyone who had ever believed that justice only belonged to the powerful. In the chaos, one thing was certain: the system had just been struck back with a single punch, and from this moment on, nothing could hold it together the way it was before. The courtroom, after Alicia's punch, still hadn't returned to order. Conversations rippled like waves, one surge barely fading before the next rose, forming a constant, unrelenting hum. On the bench, the judge kept banging his gavel, but the dry knock of wood couldn't silence the murmurs echoing through the space. Court staff moved quickly. A few officers blocked the aisles, all of them unsettled, as if they had just witnessed something far outside the order they were trained to manage. In a corner seat, a young law student trembled with excitement. He had pulled out his phone within seconds of Briggs charging forward, and Alicia rising, and the camera in his hand had captured everything from the brutal kick to the stunning punch that rocked the room. Sweat beaded on his forehead, fingers sliding across the screen, eyes lit up like he had just caught the moment of his life. He leaned forward, typing fast to a friend, "Send this out now. People need to see it." A second later, his finger hit send. The short clip, less than a minute long but packed with everything that mattered, was gone. In his rush of breath, he didn't yet know he had just triggered a storm. He only felt that this moment couldn't be buried between four walls. The video flew out like an arrow, instantly joining the current of the online world. Within minutes, a title appeared on a student forum, then spread at lightning speed: "Racist Cop Kicks Black Woman in Court." The headline was short but explosive, an accusation that pulled in hundreds of curious eyes. Phones lit up in campus cafes, on packed buses, and dorm rooms full of students. Each time someone hit play, the clip showed Briggs kicking Alicia. The startled gasps, then the flash of her punch, sending him reeling. All of it caught in a shaky, blurry video, but enough to make anyone watching hold their breath. The comment section lit up immediately. Someone typed fast, "Has he lost his mind? Kicking a black woman in court?" Another replied, "Unbelievable. This happened during a trial. This is the rawest proof that justice is being crushed. And the chain kept growing, some furious, some stunned, some swearing others, saying this was the moment the truth could no longer be hidden. Meanwhile, major platforms started to take notice, and news hunting accounts shared the clip with sharp, provoking captions. Is this the justice we believe in? On a major social media platform, the clip shot straight to the top of the day's most watched video. In the comments, words poured like a flood. One account posted, "I'm a former cop, and even I feel ashamed watching this." A medical student wrote, "You can't call him an officer of the law. That's a criminal in uniform." Every comment sparked dozens more fiery debates, piling up, all eyes turning to the name Dalton Briggs, the man who thought he held absolute power in the courtroom. Elsewhere in the city, in a small apartment, a group of friends gathered around a laptop screen. They ate dinner while the video played the blue light, casting tense expressions across their faces. A young woman slammed her hand on the table when the kick appeared. Way out of line. He really thought no one would see that. Her friends scoffed. Well, now the whole world sees. They all laughed, but the laughter carried anger and disgust. They immediately reshared the video, adding sharp captions of their own. The clip spread so fast that within an hour it had reached multiple platforms, from personal blogs to independent news channels. The captions grew heavier. White cop kicks, black woman in open court, and the punch that shook the system. What started as a short video became fuel for a massive wave of public debate. And in that storm, one phrase surged ahead, repeated with blazing speed. One person typed it, another shared it, each letter capitalized with fury. Big mistake. That phrase became more than a slogan. It turned into a tag stamped onto Briggs memes, digital posters, even graffiti sprayed onto walls in crowded streets. Within hours, the hashtag Big Mistake shot up the trending list, standing beside global headlines. Every minute, thousands more clicked share, dropped comments, joined in. Independent journalists jumped in fast, and mainstream reporters began to take notice. Back in the courtroom, Alicia still sat silently, her face revealing nothing. She didn't know that out there, phones were glowing in thousands of hands, her image threading through every corner of the city. But in the glint of a few eyes in the room and the bright stares of young students, she sensed the truth. The moment had broken past the four walls. Briggs sat back in his chair, his face flushed from the punch and the shame, unaware that the wave was already rising and he would not be able to stop it. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, droplets pounding against the glass in a steady rushing sound. Inside the courtroom, the rain echoed into the thick air, blending with the murmurs that still hadn't died down. But in the digital world, where each phone screen flickered like fireflies in the dark, another kind of flame was rising, and that flame was fueled by the short clip a trembling student had managed to record. One flash of a phone and the entire system had begun to tremble. Just hours after the clip was posted, the internet had turned into a massive storm. Twitter was flooded with links to the video, countless accounts reposting it with angry commentary. Facebook became a giant forum where millions debated, and TikTok overflowed with edited versions, looping the moment Briggs threw the kick and then staggered from Alicia's punch. The noise spread across platforms like thunder, as if the whole country was watching the same scene unfold. Each replay of the clip brought the arrogant kick and the firm punch back into focus, reminding people that justice had been insulted, but also that someone had dared to strike back for it. One account left a short comment under the video, a simple line that gained thousands of likes in minutes. The kick exposed the whole system. The words spread like wildfire, shared everywhere, turning into the unofficial slogan of the growing outrage. People no longer saw the kick as a sudden act from one man, but as a mirror reflecting a deeper truth that violence and prejudice had long seeped into places meant to uphold justice. Anonymous users, human rights activists, and young students all echoed the same line, turning it into a rallying rallying cry for a rising wave. Another user wrote, "Who is this woman? She's unbreakable." The question burst from millions of hearts. They didn't know her name, didn't know her story, only that her image was impossible to look away from. A black woman standing tall in court, taking the full force of a kick, answering with a punch, and then remaining calm and upright before hundreds of eyes had become a mysterious symbol. Curiosity caught like fire. People talked in private groups, dug through scraps of information trying to piece together Alicia's identity. But without any official details released, the mystery only added power to her presence, pulling more attention her way. As the public storm surged, an anonymous account suddenly released a series of old photos of Briggs. In them, he stood in a local bar, drink in hand-arm, wrapped tightly around a woman, his eyes full of lust. Alongside the images were accusations that Briggs had repeatedly harassed female co-workers, but was never held accountable, always shielded by his position and personal connections. Within minutes, the photos spread across the internet, shared thousands of times, turning Briggs from a self-proclaimed symbol of law into a man exposed as a long-time abuser of power. The claims, paired with the damning images, were so convincing that many didn't even wait for further proof. They believed this was the truth the system had hidden for far too long. Briggs, desperate as he watched his image mocked across the internet, decided to fight back. He agreed to appear on a local radio show, thinking his firm voice might shift the tide. On air, he spoke through clenched teeth, each word landing like a blade aimed back at the public. "She's just a colored agitator." The sentence echoed through speakers to thousands of listeners, but instead of calming the storm, poured fuel on the fire. Those already outraged grew even angrier, seeing the remark as undeniable proof of the arrogance and racism he had been trying to hide. On Twitter, the quote became an instant flashpoint. Users clipped the interview, paired it with the video of the kick, and spread it rapidly. Comments exploded, some furious, some mocking, others breaking down the quote as a window into how Briggs viewed the world. Facebook lit up with hundreds of long posts from scholars, lawyers, to everyday citizens. TikTok blew up with parody clips, young creators taking turns acting out Briggs's words, layering in sarcastic effects, turning him into a joke. The online storm spiraled beyond control. The more Briggs spoke, the more aggressive he sounded, and the more the public turned on him. Meanwhile, Alicia remained silent, never appearing or responding, and that silence only deepened her mystique, pulling public attention even tighter. People began to realize that while Briggs scrambled to defend himself with weak justifications, Alicia's image stood firm and unshaken. One side, frantic the other, composed the contrast, formed a perfect opposition, drawing more and more people toward the woman they still barely knew. Data surged in. The original clip had crossed millions of views in just one day. Related hashtags climbed to the top of trending lists with thousands of posts every hour and hundreds of thousands of shares. Mainstream media began reporting no longer just locally, but nationwide. From evening news broadcasts to online talk shows, the question echoed everywhere. What's happening with Dalton Briggs and the mysterious woman in the courtroom? The explosion on social media had officially turned a small courtroom incident into a national issue. No one could look away. Briggs couldn't stop it, and the system couldn't cover it up. One video, one punch, one kick, and then a flood of furious words had sparked a blaze that no one could extinguish. And in the pitch-black night, the glow of millions of phones still burned, lighting up a truth that had long been buried. That evening, as heavy rain poured outside, the entire city seemed to fall silent, tuned in to the local television station's evening news broadcast. The red neon sign atop the studio glowed bright, signaling a special report, and inside the tense faces and rapid keyboard clatter from the newsroom made clear this wasn't just another bulletin. A young anchor sat at the desk, voice slightly trembling but eyes sharp with resolve, opening open the segment with a single line, "We're about to show you the video that's shaken the nation over the past 24 hours." The screen behind her lit up, replaying the shaky phone footage from the courtroom. The moment Briggs kicked Alicia slowed down frame by frame. In the footage, it was clear the kick was deliberate, full force driving into the black woman standing upright in the courtroom. Each frame cut like a blade into the viewer's eyes. Gasps and murmurs escaped from inside the studio, and though everyone had already seen the clip online, slowed down, the brutality became even more stark. A second anchor explained, voice cracking with anger. This wasn't self-defense. This wasn't accidental contact. This was a direct attack inside a courtroom in front of hundreds of witnesses. The statement landed like a hammer in the minds of viewers watching from home, making many sit upright, hearts pounding with the tension of the broadcast. When the footage shifted to Briggs reeling from Alicia's punch, the studio fell into a few seconds of silence. The anchor nodded slowly, then turned to the guest across from her, a prominent civil rights attorney who had spent years fighting police brutality. He adjusted his glasses, his voice strong and unflinching, anger undisguised. "This is proof of systemic violence. Briggs isn't an outlier. He's a product of a culture that protects itself, where officers believe they can do anything, even kick a black woman in open court." His words hit hard, heavy like stone, and the studio went still before a wave of live comments flooded the on-screen chat. Viewers watching the live stream typed furiously, their messages echoing outrage, aligning in overwhelming support for what the lawyer had just declared. The anchor, a familiar face on air, leaned in and asked the question. Millions were already wondering, who is this woman? Why has she chosen silence? His eyes locked on the camera, voice stretching each word, emphasizing Alicia's mystery and pull. On the large screen behind him, Alicia's image appeared, calm face, steady eyes. Millions held their breath as if her gaze alone might reveal the answer. But the truth was, Alicia had not spoken, and that silence only deepened the public's curiosity, pushing them to learn more, to follow the story to its end. While viewers buzzed with the speculation, the broadcast aired a clip from a local radio interview recorded earlier that day where Briggs had made an appearance. In the recording, his voice came through tight and aggressive, laced with confusion but clinging to defiance. "In court, anyone who's against me is wrong." Just one short sentence, but it exposed everything. What people heard wasn't the voice of a law officer, it was the declaration of a man who believed the law was his personal weapon. As the clip ended, the studio lit up with outrage. The anchor turned to the civil rights lawyer, who couldn't hold back, his fist clenched on the desk, voice rising. "What did we just hear? A police officer publicly claims that anyone who opposes him is wrong. This is an abuse of power. This is exactly why the system must change." Each word landed like a spark tossed into dry kindling, igniting the audience outside. Online, the comments surged, calling for investigations for termination, some demanding Briggs be brought to court immediately. The footage, played again and again, now accompanied by analysis from criminal justice experts, psychologists, and even former officers who had left the force over internal violence, all agreed that Briggs wasn't an isolated case. He was a clear example of institutional rot. The story, once a single video clip, had become a nationwide debate. Other networks broke their regular programming to join in airing urgent updates, replaying footage, and interviewing people on the streets. In bars, apartments, and restaurants, everyone was glued to the screen. On a small city corner, a group of young black men watched the news while finishing dinner. When Briggs's quote, "In court, anyone who's against me is wrong," played again. One of them slammed a fist on the table, eyes blazing. He thinks he's king now. Justice belongs to him. The whole group nodded. Anger rising, and within minutes some had already reposted the broadcast to their own pages, calling on friends to speak up too. From the television broadcast, the fire spread across every platform. The video that had already gone viral on social media was now amplified by the credibility of mainstream media. What had once been shaky, blurry footage from a phone was now broken down frame by frame on national television, analyzed by experts repeated so often that no one could forget it. Briggs was no longer just a familiar name in a small town. He had become a symbol of corruption condemned by the entire country. Alicia, the mysterious woman, became the center of attention, even though she still hadn't spoken a single word. The whole nation felt like it was burning. The fire hadn't come from a dry article or a political statement, but from images no one could deny played over and over. As the broadcast ended, the anchor turned back to the camera, voice firm. This is no longer the story of one person. This is the story of an entire system. And we will keep watching to find the truth, to make sure justice is no longer distorted. Outside, the rain kept falling, but in the hearts of millions, a fire was blazing. And that fire had been fanned by television, something no one, no matter how hard they tried, could stop. In a narrow room on the lowest floor of the courthouse, the dim light from a row of surveillance monitors cast a pale glow on the tired face of a young technician. He sat hunched over the control panel, dark circles under his eyes from too many hours awake, fingers clicking rapidly as he scanned through the footage from the chaotic hearing. Outside, only the steady sound of rain and the muffled noise of a crowd that hadn't dispersed filtered down. The room was thick with the smell of electronics and old dust, but the technician didn't notice because his eyes had suddenly locked onto a frame that made his heart pound. On the screen, Briggs was seen stepping down from the witness stand, his face etched with rage, then charging directly at Alicia. The security camera had no audio, but every movement was clear, from the heavy steps to the outstretched arm aiming to shove. Alicia stood her ground, pivoted, and struck back, the image sharp and undeniable, leaving no room for denial. The technician sat up straight, eyes wide. He rewound the footage, zoomed in frame by frame, a chill running down his spine. All of Briggs's earlier defenses, his radio claims that he'd been provoked, were now dust. What the camera captured was cold, emotionless evidence, and in that impartiality the truth was clearer than ever. Briggs hadn't defended himself, he had attacked, and this video was a mirror showing exactly who he was. He hesitated for a few seconds, then quickly saved the clip to a separate hard drive. His fingers trembled slightly as he named the file, knowing full well he'd just touched a piece of evidence that could shift the entire case. His eyes stayed locked on the screen as the system confirmed the file had been copied. In that moment, he understood that Briggs's secret wouldn't stay hidden much longer. He wouldn't be the one to leak it, but he knew the video wouldn't stay confined within the cold walls of this tech room, because the truth always finds its way into the light. Just hours later, a new video surfaced on online forums. This time, it wasn't a shaky student phone clip, but a wide-angle security recording, steady and crystal clear. Briggs storming forward, Alicia standing tall, the confrontation exploding. It was all there, irrefutable. The caption beneath was simple, but powerful enough to ignite a firestorm. The camera doesn't lie. The clip spread instantly, because the world had been arguing fiercely, and now the argument had met its end with undeniable proof. The comments flooded beneath the video with the people exclaiming that now everything was clear. There was no room left for Briggs to dodge, no chance for him to twist the truth. Each time someone replayed the moment, Briggs charged forward. Sighs and curses echoed again, followed by praise for Alicia's rare composure. Society seemed to hold its breath for a few seconds as that frame played, then erupted more fiercely, because they knew justice had just gained a new undeniable ally, the cold, unblinking eye of the camera. And so, from the quiet tech room of the courthouse, a lifeless clip became a new spark, igniting the already surging wave of public outrage. Alicia remained silent. Briggs kept roaring, but now the truth was exposed through those frames, and everyone understood that from this moment on the storm could not be stopped. Social media exploded the instant the security footage was released. The crystal-clear frames showed Briggs charging with fury in his eyes while Alicia stood firm, pivoted, and struck back. No one could spin or excuse the action anymore, and the public immediately turned it into a movement. Waves of justice for Alicia flooded every platform, appearing in personal posts and glowing across digital banners in the streets. People scrawled it on walls, printed it on t-shirts, turned it into the soundtrack for viral clips, and within hours Alicia's name had broken free from that of a mere witness, becoming the symbol of an entire fight. Ordinary people who usually scrolled social media for entertainment now stopped to watch closely. A young mother holding her sleeping baby in a tiny apartment opened her phone, saw Alicia's image, and whispered, "She stood up for so many of us." A taxi driver turned up the radio to catch the news, murmuring the slogan like it was a prayer. The more people repeated it, the more the phrase took on new meaning, not just justice for one person, but for the thousands whose lives had been trampled in silence. What stood out most was Alicia's silence. No posts appeared on her social media, no press statements, no status updates or public messages. While Briggs kept appearing on the radio to shout his defenses, Alicia's continued silence only deepened the public's curiosity. People asked, "Who is she? Why hasn't she spoken? Is she preparing something greater?" Every gap in information was filled with speculation, and that speculation only made Alicia's name more mysterious, more magnetic, like a beacon in the dark. That contrast pushed public opinion firmly toward Alicia. People compared the image of Briggs arguing fuming, spitting, venomous words with that of Alicia, calm, silent, yet unwavering. The fewer words she spoke, the stronger she appeared in the eyes of the public. Many commentators wrote that her silence was her sharpest weapon because it let the image speak in place of word. And every time the clip played again, people could read in Alicia's eyes a clear affirmation that needed no voice. Across forums, waves of posts calling to protect and honor Alicia spread at lightning speed. Someone wrote, "We don't know her name beyond Alicia, but we know she deserves justice." Another declared, "Justice for Alicia is justice for all of us." The power of the movement expanded beyond one city, spreading nationwide. Candlelight vigils began to appear, homemade. Posters were pinned to lampposts, and stories about Alicia were retold again and again in cafes, on buses, and in classrooms. And through it all, Alicia still chose silence. But her silence wasn't avoidance. It was like a fire conserving its heat to erupt at the decisive moment. That's why with each passing day, people grew more curious, more eager. The name Alicia became the center of attention, and along with the chant, "Justice for Alicia," it turned into a rising wave that pulled the entire society with it, forcing every eye to turn, forcing the whole system to brace for an unprecedented quake. That evening, the bright lights of the famous talk show studio spilled across the glossy floor, the audience packed tightly into every seat, all waiting for the story that had ignited the entire nation to be discussed. The host appeared, his dark suit making his sharp eyes stand out, and sat down with a strained smile before posing the question millions outside were also asking, "Who is she?" The question echoed through the speakers. The room fell briefly silent, then a wave of applause erupted as if the crowd had been waiting for that exact moment to release their anticipation. Cameras swept across the tense faces in the studio, everyone focused on the host waiting for an answer even the media hadn't yet uncovered. The guests began sharing their initial thoughts. A political journalist suggested that based on how Alicia responded in court, she couldn't be an ordinary person but must have undergone intense training. Her movements were clean and decisive, her gaze steady. "That's the demeanor of a soldier," he said, prompting murmurs of agreement from the crowd. A young female attorney offered a different view. "Maybe she's a colleague in the legal field, someone who understands courtroom procedure, because staying that calm under such pressure isn't easy." That idea spread quickly, and many nodded in agreement. Another guest, a former judge, emphasized she could be just a witness, but a remarkable one because she stood up in the face of a raging officer. Meanwhile, social media exploded with speculation. On Twitter, dozens of accounts suggested Alicia might be a veteran who had served in multiple military operations, explaining how she withstood the kick and countered with such precision. On Facebook, many wrote that Alicia must be a seasoned lawyer, pointing to her composure and sharp response as signs of courtroom experience. On TikTok, young users turned the mystery into a trend, editing short videos with the caption, "Who is Alicia?" that racked up millions of views. Theories stacked on top of one another, but they remained just that, guesses, because Alicia still hadn't spoken, and that silence only pushed curiosity to its peak. The host ended the discussion in a measured voice. "Maybe we don't know who she is yet, but one thing's clear, she's not just anyone." That sentence hung like an ellipsis on the screen, leaving viewers breathless. In coffee shops, family apartments, out on the streets, people repeated the question, passing it from one mouth to another until it became a collective obsession. Everyone understood that the true identity of the woman who took down Briggs was the final missing piece in the puzzle, and once revealed, it wouldn't just be another headline, it could shake the very system already under intense scrutiny. Briggs sat in the live studio with a stiff expression, his eyes darting between the host and the audience, as if searching for something to hold on to. When asked about the woman who had ignited national outrage, he repeated a single line, his voice hoarse but strained to sound firm: "She's nobody." He stressed the word nobody so hard, the veins in his neck bulged as if trying to hammer it down like a nail that would silence all doubt. But the more he said it, the more his trembling lips betrayed him. He tried to appear confident, but sweat formed on his forehead, and his clenched hand rested tightly on his knee. The studio audience stared at him, their eyes filled with contempt and suspicion, recognizing that his lifeless repetition was a shield for fear. The phrase, "she's nobody," echoed over and over, but instead of ending speculation, it became proof that Briggs was losing his grip, unraveling in front of a truth he could no longer control. The host didn't interrupt, letting him repeat it several times as if deliberately exposing the unraveling. While Briggs stumbled through meaningless denials, viewers flooded social media with clips from the broadcast. They isolated the moment he growled, "She's nobody," and paired it with the image of Alicia standing tall in the courtroom, her eyes sharp as steel. That contrast made it even clearer who was truly strong and who was crumbling. Comments poured in mocking Briggs, calling him a coward, afraid of a name he refused to say. Meanwhile, back on the broadcast, the host turned toward the other side of the table, passing the spotlight to a veteran investigative journalist who had just joined the panel. The journalist adjusted his microphone, his voice calm, but his eyes steady with conviction. He spoke, briefly, firmly. "A source says she's about to be appointed to a position within the police force." The words shot out like an arrow cutting through the heavy air in the studio. There was a moment of silence, then murmurs erupted. The host tilted his head slightly, the audience gasped, and Briggs froze for a moment, eyes wide as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. The silence was quickly broken by the soft tap of the journalist's fingers on the desk as he added, "If that's true, then the man sitting here kicked his future superior in the gut." The line drew bitter laughter from the crowd, a few scattered claps, not out of amusement but from the release of anger. Briggs turned his face away, his lips trembling, but no words came out. For a moment, the studio turned into an arena, every gaze locked on Briggs and his unraveling. The line, "She's nobody," now looked absurd when placed next to the journalist's heavy revelation. Viewers at home quickly clipped and shared the moment online, captioning it with biting sarcasm. "Nobody or the next chief of police." The contrast between denial and leaked truth exposed Briggs as a man revealing his own weakness to the world. Online debates flared with new energy, people stunned and thrilled, waiting for confirmation. In that moment, the public realized that the question, "Who is she?" was no longer a mystery but a revelation powerful enough to shake the entire system. The next morning, the city prosecutor's office lit up brightly as dozens of reporters gathered outside, each wanting to be the first to report on the latest legal development. Inside the building, tension filled the hallways and meeting rooms. On a long table, covered in a white cloth, a stack of neatly arranged files sat in front of microphones labeled by different agencies. The chief prosecutor stood, his voice echoing through the room, drawing every gaze. A special investigative committee is officially being formed to clarify everything that happened during the hearing. No one, not even a police officer, is above the law. The brief statement was enough to trigger a wave of shock. Some nodded subtly, others exchanged glances as if witnessing the start of a no-holds-barred battle. The news spread quickly. The press launched live coverage. Headlines exploded. Special committee to investigate. Briggs justice enters a decisive phase. Meanwhile, in a private room, Briggs sat motionless in his chair, hands clasped together, his usual arrogance gone. He knew the statement was a verdict hanging above his head, and nothing would protect him now like it once had. He was used to mistakes being overlooked, believed his uniform was a shield, but this time what happened in front of hundreds of witnesses and security cameras had shattered that illusion. Briggs tried to remain calm, but his pounding heart and the sweat rolling down his face betrayed the fear he was trying to hide. On the first day the committee went into action, Briggs was summoned to answer questions. He entered the investigation room heavily, his steps no longer steady like they had been in court. In front of him sat 3 prosecutors and 2 independent experts, all watching him with piercing eyes. On the table, a computer screen displayed the security camera footage. As soon as Briggs sat down, the video played, showing him storming down from the witness stand, his face twisted in rage, followed by a violent kick and shove. There was no sound, but every movement spoke volume. Briggs swallowed hard, forcing a weak smile, but his eyes darted, and all confidence had drained away. A prosecutor asked bluntly, his tone flat and cold as steel. "Can you explain why you initiated a physical attack on a witness?" Briggs coughed lightly, his voice hoarse, then tried to say, "I was just reacting to provocation." But the video was immediately rewound and slowed clearly, showing Alicia standing still, her expression calm, while Briggs was the only one moving, charging forward in aggression. A heavy silence fell over the room. Briggs opened his mouth, but no words came. The justification he clung to was stripped away in seconds, and he fell silent, his lips trembling but unable to speak. The entire committee looked at him like a man lost, and his silence was a clearer admission than any confession. Outside, news of the summons spread instantly. The media showed images of Briggs walking into the interrogation room with his head down, no longer the man who once called himself the law. People read the news, talked nonstop, and many sighed with relief that the system was finally forced to open the door to a serious investigation. The phrase "justice for Alicia" kept appearing now, heavier with meaning due to Briggs's helpless silence in the face of undeniable evidence. The entire city seemed drawn into the case. Every conversation in cafes, on buses, even in classrooms revolved around one question: what will happen to Briggs now that justice has officially opened its door? In that small room, Briggs kept his head low, fingers tightly interlocked, eyes clouded. He had once believed that shouting threatening would make people fall silent like always. But this time, the truth was illuminated by the unfeeling eye of the camera, and the prosecutors across from him no longer wanted to hear hollow justifications. A man who once thought he was the law now sat powerless before it. And from this moment, there was no doubt left. Briggs's path led only toward a depth from which he could not return. The moment the investigation door opened, a wave of witnesses emerged like small flames feeding a growing fire. In the early days, one by one, they entered the interrogation room, eyes still showing traces of fear, but voices voices growing steadier as they described what they had seen. A young court employee said Briggs was always arrogant, often barking at even unrelated colleagues, and that on the day of the hearing he saw the fury in Briggs's eyes as he charged toward Alicia. A middle-aged woman once seated in the public gallery raised her hand with a trembling vow to tell the truth, then described the kick in detail, her eyes red from the memory. Her account tightened the room with tension, every word matching the footage the committee already possessed. The next day, more voices joined in. A former police officer, once a colleague of Briggs, appeared unexpectedly with testimony that Briggs had long used his power to intimidate, had assaulted detainees in holding cells, but always found ways to cover it up. His statement deepened the room's gravity, expanding the issue beyond the hearing, turning Briggs from someone who made a mistake into a symbol of habitual abuse of power. A student who had been there that day also stood to testify, saying that when he heard Briggs insult Alicia, he felt suffocated with rage, and when she stood and fought back, his heart exploded. He said, "That moment gave me faith that justice is still alive." These testimonies were more than personal truths. They reminded the committee that the case had grown far beyond a single courtroom incident. At the same time, out in the hallway, the stack of complaint files grew higher. At first, it was just a few scattered forms from local civil organizations, but the number quickly surged. Within 1 week, the district attorney's office received hundreds of group complaints, each bundle thick with dozens of signatures detailing bitter experiences people had faced when dealing with abusive officers like Briggs. From civil rights groups to independent legal organizations, all sent the same message. This was no longer just about one woman being attacked, but an alarm bell for the entire community. The files were open, the black and white pages becoming legal weapons aimed squarely at the system that had long protected Briggs. One group of parents filed a complaint stating their children had been stopped by local police without cause. A group of veterans signed a petition declaring that the humiliation Alicia endured echoed the pain they had once suffered. The turning point came when a nationwide alliance of human rights organizations joined in promising to pursue the case to the very end. The investigation door had not only opened to pull Briggs into the legal spotlight, but also to give thousands of others a chance to finally speak the truths they had once been forced to silence. The appearance of witnesses and the wave of collective complaints marked a turning point. Briggs was no longer facing only public opinion or media scrutiny, but an increasingly tight legal net closing around him. The testimonies, the documents all came together like arrows aimed directly at a man who had grown used to wielding unchecked authority. From that moment on, it became clear to everyone that this was no longer a televised debate, but a full-scale legal confrontation where Briggs would find no easy way out. The day the public hearing reopened, the courthouse was packed from early morning. Outside, hundreds of people gathered holding signs demanding justice, their eyes filled with anticipation. Voices echoed from the hallway to the worn wooden stairs, the air thick with curiosity and outrage. When Briggs appeared, flashes from reporters' cameras lit up non-stop, his face flushed red, his eyes blinking rapidly as if searching for an escape in the sea of people staring straight at him. He entered the courtroom still carrying the posture of someone used to standing in a place of power, but his expression clearly betrayed confusion. When called to the witness stand, Briggs took a deep breath and tried to regain his confidence, his voice loud but lacking conviction. He forced out each word as if trying to convince the world. "She provoked me first." The accusation came out dry and simple, but in the silent courtroom it rang hollow. A few people in the public gallery let out bitter laughs, heads shook across the room like a ripple effect. Briggs went on insisting he had no choice, claiming his actions were meant to maintain order. His voice grew louder, but the truth seemed thinner with every word. The prosecutor didn't take long. He opened his laptop and connected it to the large screen in the center of the courtroom. "Let's watch the security footage." The short sentence pierced the tense air like a needle. The screen lit up blue, showing the scene from an overhead angle. It captured Briggs stepping off the stand, face full of anger, a cold kick, then Alicia holding her ground and striking back. Every frame was clear and sharp, unlike the shaky student video. The room held its breath, eyes fixed on the screen each second, slicing into Briggs like a needle to skin. In that moment, all of his justifications collapsed. There was no sign of provocation, no gesture that suggested Alicia was a threat. Everything pointed to one simple truth: Briggs initiated the attack. When the screen went dark, silence filled the courtroom, heavy enough to hear his quickened breaths. The prosecutor turned to him, eyes cold. "Do you have anything to add?" Briggs opened his mouth, but his throat closed up. His voice rasped, and his excuses dissolved into empty air. The room began to buzz. Then came mocking laughter, angry shouts. Some people stood pointing directly at Briggs, calling him a liar. The judge had to strike the gavel repeatedly, but the outrage had spread too far to contain. Briggs's face turned pale, his eyes darted, his hands clenched tightly together like he was holding on to something that no longer existed. Everyone in the courtroom no longer looked at him as a witness, but as a man exposed in full view, a figure of guilt under the harsh light. From that moment on, no one believed a word he said. The public trial exposed not just a single kick, but a pattern of abuse hidden behind excuses. Briggs lost the familiar mask he had worn, leaving only a trembling face and vacant eyes. His lies were stripped away right in the courtroom he once believed he could manipulate, and it was here that justice began to reclaim its rightful place. When the video on the screen went dark, the silence in the room lasted only seconds before breaking into bitter laughter. It wasn't the laughter of joy, but of anger and exhaustion. People weren't laughing because it was funny. They were laughing because the truth had finally been laid bare, tearing down the lies Briggs had repeated again and again. A man in the middle row crossed his arms and let out a dry, bitter laugh as if to vent. A few young students buried their heads into their arms, trembling in frustration, and an older woman shook her head, her laugh blending with tears. The entire courtroom had watched him try to force out meaningless justifications, and now, with the evidence right in front of them, the only response left was laughter, sharp as a blade cutting straight into his arrogance. On the witness stand, Briggs quickly wiped the sweat from his brow. His hand trembled, and the beads of sweat rolling down carried the fear he could no longer hide. Each time the crowd laughed, his shoulders twitched, his eyes blinked rapidly, his face flushed, then turned pale. He had grown used to looks of respect, to silent submission, but now every gaze bore into him with scorn and ridicule. Sweat soaked the collar of his shirt, clinging to his skin, suffocating, and in that breathless moment, Briggs realized power could no longer shield him. The judge struck the gavel repeatedly to restore order, but the laughter still echoed the sound of a verdict already declared by the public before the court could even conclude. Briggs bowed his head, hands clenched, but no words left his throat. His silence no longer looked like defiance, but the final stance of someone cornered. In that thick, oppressive air, a sudden sound came from outside, slipping through the cracked window and jolting the room. "Justice for Alicia." A voice rang out loud and clear, heard by everyone inside. Instantly, it was echoed by others, swelling into a chorus. "Justice for Alicia" rang out in unison beyond the courthouse walls, each chant like a drumbeat. Inside, people turned to one another, eyes lit up, realizing the crowd had transformed its outrage into a collective force. Through the window, hundreds of people could be seen holding signs. High fists clenched their faces, resolute beneath the light drizzle. The chant wasn't just a slogan. It was a declaration that Alicia was no longer alone. Each shout flowed into the courtroom like a current, connecting hearts on fire, making Briggs's silence even more humiliating. In that moment, every barrier between inside and outside seemed to disappear as the entire community spoke with one voice. Justice could not be denied. distorted. Briggs sat there, sweat still dripping, eyes vacant, while the relentless chant outside kept echoing a verdict he would never escape. The next day, the city's central square was packed with people from early morning. The crowd grew larger by the hour, forming a vast sea of people stretching from the city hall steps to the surrounding streets. In their hands were hastily written but powerful signs, bold words expressing a shared desire. Justice. The signs rose high, catching the morning sunlight like white waves rolling through the heart of the city. The air was thick with resolve, but instead of violence, the crowd chose calm chanting, steady slogans that echoed off the buildings around the square. At the center, a makeshift stage stood with wooden frames and loudspeakers. A speaker stepped up, small in stature, but with a voice that carried. Holding the mic, he lifted his head and declared, "No one gets to kick justice." The words cut through the air like a sharp blade, striking everyone with the memory of a moment the entire nation had witnessed on screen. The crowd erupted in agreement, clapping and cheering as one. Many wiped away tears, knowing the words weren't just for one man, but for a culture that had long ignored human dignity. Each shout repeated and amplified a massive chorus rising from thousands of voices, leaving no one untouched. On the steps, a group of students held handwritten signs, the shaky lines, "Proud Justice for Alicia." They couldn't hide their excitement as hundreds around them echoed the words they'd written. At the edge of the square, a middle-aged white man carried his young son on his shoulders so the boy could see the sea of people. The child's eyes sparkled, his lips mouthing the slogans, and the father gripped his hand tightly, wanting to pass down the belief that justice must never be trampled. All around, stories were shared. An elderly woman told nearby youth she had seen many injustices, but never a crowd so united. A young man with a megaphone reminded everyone to stay peaceful, saying that calm was their greatest strength. The crowd nodded, holding their lines, the chants synchronized, forming a collective force that nothing could shake. The image spread through dozens of cameras, streamed live online, and in every comment, people wrote that this was proof of a community standing up for truth. Police stood scattered across the square, their faces tense, but no one dared to act rashly. They saw the sheer size of the crowd, the force in those determined eyes, and they knew that any wrong move would only make the fire erupt more fiercely. Amid the sea of people and thundering chants, a silent pressure spread through those in power because they understood the message had been delivered loud and clear. Justice was no longer an abstract idea, but something being declared by thousands of voices right in front of them. No one gets to kick justice. The square glowed not just with sunlight, but with the conviction burning in each person's chest. This moment marked a turning point when scattered voices joined as one, echoing loud enough to break through any wall. From here, no one could ignore the surge of justice rising outside. In the days when the square still echoed with chants and unwavering eyes, Alicia's image unexpectedly rose beyond that of an individual and became a symbol. Strangely, no one really knew who she was, aside from a video of a counterpunch and a defiant stare, but that very lack of information wrapped her in a mysterious glow. On city walls, posters showed a sketched face of a black woman with sharp eyes printed below in bold letters, "Justice." Online, thousands of illustrations, collages, and artistic symbols spread rapidly, all tied to a figure who had never spoken, never officially appeared in public. Alicia became a face people didn't need to see clearly because her actions alone had already defined her. Alicia's silence turned her into a question for all of society. People saw in her the spirit of warriors from history, those who chose action over words. Articles in print and online repeated, "An unnamed woman shook the foundation of justice." The phrase was repeated so often that it became a slogan. Activists called her living proof of the power of resistance. Artists painted her into murals, and musicians wrote songs inspired by that single moment. Without stepping onto any stage, Alicia remained present in every conversation and every glance when justice was mentioned. Yet, precisely because she never appeared, public curiosity kept growing. People speculated on television, in cafes and classrooms, even during formal meetings. Everyone had a theory. Some believed she was a veteran. Others said she was a lawyer. Some insisted she was just an ordinary citizen brave enough not to bow. That uncertainty became a massive wave of intrigue, and slowly curiosity turned into a need to know the truth. The words, "Who is Alicia?" appeared everywhere, becoming an open question, not just about her identity, but about a generation searching for a symbol of justice. The public craved an answer because they wanted to know whether that woman could continue to lead the belief they had just found. In televised discussions, sociologists argued that Alicia's image held more power than many political figures because it was tied to real experience, to a scar, to an action that touched people's hearts. Every time someone mentioned her, the air seemed to pause because they felt they were speaking about something greater than just one person. And that very anticipation made public sentiment boil even more, because they believed that once the secret was revealed, the truth would change the entire game. Among the steady crowd gathering in the square with chants echoing and eyes full of conviction, Alicia slowly became an invisible banner. Though she hadn't appeared, she was still leading a movement, and though her face remained hidden, she drew the attention of an entire society. That very absence made people not only want to know more, but also ready to defend her once the truth came to light. And from casual conversations to major political forums, one question kept echoing: who really is Alicia? In the large conference room of the police department, fluorescent lights shone brightly, but couldn't chase away the heavy tension in the air. On the wall, framed boards listing departmental codes hung neatly, yet they seemed purely symbolic compared to what was unfolding. Officers sat in long rows around the large wooden table, their faces tense. At the head of the table, Briggs tapped his finger hard on the wood, his eyes still bearing their usual fury, but his arrogance had dimmed after days of public and media exposure. He scanned the room, hoping to find familiar support, but instead of loyalty, all he saw in his colleagues' eyes was hesitation and discontent. A young officer, leaning upright, his face still marked by the earnestness of a newcomer, suddenly spoke up. He stood, one hand on the table, his voice clear and firm, though laced with a nervous tremor, knowing he was poking a hornet's nest. "Sir, we can't keep pretending nothing happened. What you did in court, we all saw it, the public saw it, and if we stay silent now, we turn this department into a joke." His words shook the room. Some turned to look at each other, a few lowered their heads, and others nodded subtly in agreement. Though simple, his words echoed what many had long thought but never dared say. Briggs shot up his chair, slamming into the wall with a loud bang. He planted both hands on the table, his face flushed, voice growling like a cornered animal. "Don't betray me." He stressed each word, his voice dry and sharp in the wide room. To him, the challenge wasn't just a personal attack, it was a rejection of the power he'd clung to for years. He glared at the young officer, eyes blazing, trying to crush him with intimidation. But the officer stood firm, fist clenched, gaze unwavering, and that quiet defiance inspired others nearby to shift closer, tapping their fingers on the table in silent support. The tension was thick enough to feel every breath. A lieutenant on the right cleared his throat and looked Briggs in the eye, his voice calm but resolute. "We're not betraying you. You betrayed the badge on your chest. That's the truth no one here can deny." The words hit Briggs hard, not because they came from an outsider, but from within the very ranks he once trusted to protect him. A few more officers nodded, and slowly the room's allegiance began to tilt toward the truth. Briggs panted, sweat dotting his forehead. He realized the wall that once protected him was cracking, each brick of camaraderie beginning to fall away. The room was silent, but within that silence echoed the piercing sound of a collapsing power. And in that moment, Briggs understood he hadn't just lost the public, but even those who once wore the same uniform no longer wanted to stand with him. A long pause settled over the room after Briggs growled his demand that no one betray him. The harsh fluorescent lights beamed down, highlighting every bead of sweat on his flushed, angry face. No one spoke, but the silence was the clearest answer. Then, from the far end of the table, a seasoned lieutenant stood. He was tall, gray-haired, with the worn face of someone who had endured hundreds of long night shifts. His voice rang low, slow, but steady, as if each word was sharpened by experience. "You betrayed the badge." The sentence dropped into the room and sat heavy like a verdict. Briggs froze, eyes wide, his expression faltering. He stared at the lieutenant, trying to appear defiant, but the unease in his eyes gave him away. The gold badge gleaming on his chest had once been his pride, the symbol he raised as proof of authority. Now, that same symbol stood as evidence against him. The lieutenant's words weren't just a personal rebuke, but the voice of those who still believed in discipline and honor. Other officers, silent until now, began exchanging glances, their looks toward Briggs no longer deferential but cold and distant. Briggs scanned the room, desperate for a nod, a flicker of support, but all he met was a wall of silence. He shifted in his seat, forcing a crooked smile that only exposed his desperation. His broad back looked lonelier than ever, like a lone island surrounded by a rising sea. Once, when he spoke, dozens would follow. Now, not a single voice rose to defend him. The air was so heavy he could hear a weary sigh from the end of the table, the faint tapping of a pen, like a metronome ticking toward his downfall. In Briggs' mind, memories of his rookie days came flooding back. He had once been trained to understand that the badge on his chest was more than metal. It was honor, a symbol of the public's trust. But years of power had turned that badge into a tool of arrogance. Now, as the lieutenant's firm words echoed, he realized he had lost the very core of what it meant to serve. Fear surged through him, heart pounding, breath short, like a man grasping for footing at the edge of a cliff. The room was no longer a place for colleagues to meet, but a miniature courtroom. Those who once called him their superior now looked at him like a defendant. The silence, the cold stares, and the words just spoken all came together as a collective verdict. Briggs slumped into his chair, fists clenched but trembling, head bowed low. In that moment, he understood he no longer had a place. The badge on his chest was no longer a symbol of honor, but a mark reminding him he had betrayed everything it stood for. Briggs felt completely isolated. Every familiar path had closed, every once familiar face now distant, no hand extended. He sat in a crowded room, yet felt as cold as if he'd fallen into a hollow void. That loneliness didn't come from physical distance, but from the fact that he had severed the final tie to his fellow officers. And from that moment on, Briggs understood his downfall didn't come only from the outside, but also from within the very ranks that once protected him. In the grand hall of the special hearing, the cold white light from dozens of ceiling lamps made the space feel even more frigid. The audience seats were packed, reporters jostled for the best spots, and camera flashes fired non-stop. This was no longer a closed trial like before. It was a public stage where every eye was watching, where there was no room for concealment or excuse. When the prosecutor stood up holding a file, his voice rang out firm and clear. Sheriff Dalton Briggs's actions represent a severe abuse of power, one that cannot be tolerated. This wasn't just a kick at a black woman. It was a kick at the very justice we are sworn to protect. His words echoed through the courtroom, each one like a dagger aimed directly at the man sitting across from him. Briggs kept his head down, both hands clenched on the table, his face no longer flushed with anger, but pale and drained. He had once believed he could bluff his way through with firm words, but when the prosecutor stressed the term abuse of power, his throat tightened. The evidence was undeniable, from the security footage to witness testimonies, from old photographs to the flood of legal complaints. Everything formed a solid wall he could no longer break through. Briggs glanced around, hoping for a supportive gaze, but all he saw were stern faces, cold eyes ready to deliver judgment. The air in the room grew thick, every breath tense. The judge leaned forward, listening as the prosecutor continued laying out the charges. He emphasized that a police officer using violence in a courtroom was a clear sign that the system had been eroded by a mindset placed officers above the law. If we don't address this today, tomorrow there will be more like Briggs, and each kick will be another blow to the public's trust. The courtroom remained remained still, and then, after a pause, a scattering of applause began, soft at first, then growing louder until it became a sustained wave. The room was heated with tension, but the solemnity of the hearing remained intact. When the indictment was read, Briggs lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot, yet he couldn't muster a word of rebuttal. Mr. Dalton Briggs is hereby charged with abuse of power, assaulting a witness, and gross misconduct. He will face appropriate legal penalties. The statement fell like thunder shaking the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras panned across the room while outside a new wave of chanting rose from the crowd. Briggs shifted uneasily, his hands tremble in sweat covering his face. He now knew the wall of power that once shielded him had completely collapsed. In that moment, Briggs no longer appeared as a once arrogant officer, but as a criminal exposed to the light. Citizens watched reporters, documented prosecutors continued presenting evidence, all forming a verdict even before the judge could strike the gavel. All that remained for Briggs was fear and bitterness, because he knew that from now on every road ahead led to a fall. And as he faced the sentence about to be announced, the public outside grew louder, realizing that justice had truly entered its decisive stage, where the man who once called himself the law now had to bow before it. The courtroom was silent after the prosecutor firmly read the indictment, but the silence wasn't peaceful. People packed the wooden benches, eyes fixed on the judge's bench, hands clenched as if bracing for the most important moment. No one breathed heavily. No one looked away. Even seasoned reporters fell quiet, pens poised above their notepads. The tension was so thick that even the faintest sound would startle many. That sense of suspense spread all the way to the hallway where hundreds still stood by the door, listening closely to the loudspeaker or watching the live stream. They wanted to witness with their own eyes the man who once spoke in the name of a law, bowing before the law itself, and they refused to let any hesitation push the case into obscurity. Amid that silence, whispers began to spread, weaving through rows of benches, then leaking outside like a flame catching wind. People murmured that sources confirmed the woman in the video wasn't anonymous at all, that she was about to be appointed to a high-ranking position in law enforcement. What began as quiet talk in the corridor quickly escalated, passed among journalists, and flashed across phone screens. New police chief. The question popped up on forums and spread at lightning speed. Each person added a new piece to the puzzle. Some claiming they saw her at a military ceremony, others insisting they'd heard her name on a recent appointment list. Curiosity, already high, now surged into a frenzy. Social media was flooded with posts and shares, many asserting that Alicia was about to step into the most powerful seat in the department. The illustrations that once simply read "Justice for Alicia" now bore the added word "Chief" in bold red font. TV channels brought in waves of analysts to debate, arguing whether someone once publicly humiliated could really be preparing to lead the entire police force. As more theories emerged, public anticipation mounted, and everyone waited to see how the truth would break. Briggs sat at the corner of the table, listening to the constant murmur around him, his face pale. He realized he hadn't just lost in the courtroom, but in the hearts of the public. While he faced charges of abuse of power, the woman he had dismissed was now being spoken of as a symbol of change. The more he tried to brush it off, the more the rumor of the new police chief became a burning topic like a tidal wave he could no longer stop. The entire room, the entire city, and the entire country seemed to be holding their breath together, waiting for an unprecedented moment. The public wasn't just anxious to hear the sentence handed to Briggs, but also to see if the rumor about Alicia would actually come true. And in that dense atmosphere, one belief grew clearer by the second. If the rumor was true, then Briggs's kick wasn't just a mistake. It was a big mistake that would mark the end of an era of unchecked abuse in the shadows. The National Press Conference took place in a vast auditorium. Hundreds of reporters packed together, camera flashes firing like a meteor shower. In front stood a dignified podium draped in deep blue cloth. Behind it, the national flag and the city's police department flag. The moment awaited for days had finally arrived. The large screen lit up and Alicia appeared. The camera panned slowly, settling on her upright figure in a striking red suit. Every proud feature magnified on screen, stirring murmurs throughout the room. Millions watching on television fell silent as if time itself had paused, leaving only a single defining moment. Alicia stepped up to the podium, her eyes fierce, her face calm yet powerful. The murmurs from the audience gradually died down, replaced by a heavy silence before the storm. She looked around, her lips curving into a soft smile, both warm and proud. That small gesture rippled through the room for days. They'd only seen her silent in clips, and now she stood before them, the woman who had shaken an entire system. No one knew what she would say, but everyone understood this moment would change everything. Alicia calmly reached into her jacket pocket, her movement slow but firm. A flash of silver gleamed under the studio lights, and as her hand rose, the entire room erupted in shock. In her hand was a gleaming badge, the ultimate symbol of power in the police department. Alicia spoke firmly, her voice clear, each word carved into the air. "I am the new chief of police." The words rang out sharp and final, sending a tremor through the hall. Cheers exploded from the audience, camera flashes, blinding reporters leapt to their feet, shouting her name. Across live broadcasts nationwide, people at home gripped hands and screamed. Some burst into tears, and others pointed at their screens in disbelief. The shockwave spread instantly, turning rumor into truth, transforming Alicia from a mysterious witness into the one now leading the very system she had once stood against. Social media lit up in seconds, audiences everywhere, typing the same words the chief has spoken. At that moment, Briggs appeared on a broadcast screen in a smaller room, his face pale, his eyes hollow. Where once he had used his badge to assert dominance, now the badge in Alicia's hand stood as the most vivid proof of a power shift. Her proud smile was enough to make him tremble, because he knew that every excuse, every illusion of authority he had clung to had just been buried for good. The press conference hall was not just a place for revealing an identity, but a witness to rebirth. Alicia stood there, raising the badge like a flag, affirming that justice no longer belonged to those who abused it, but had returned to those willing to protect it. The chants outside blended with the cheers inside, forming a victorious symphony. And from that moment, the truth stepped fully into the light, brilliant and undeniable. The hall fell into a brief, stunned silence after Alicia's decisive announcement. Hundreds of eyes widened, mouths slightly parted as if to ask something more, but no one managed to speak. Cameras panned across the rows of seats, capturing faces frozen in disbelief, some hands covering mouths, others glancing around to make sure they hadn't misheard. That initial silence didn't last. It felt more like a collective, deep breath before the explosion. Seconds later, cheers erupted like thunder tearing through the thick atmosphere. Reporters stood up, cameras raised high flashes, firing like lightning through a storm. The once solemn hall transformed into a chaotic sea of sound, where all bore witness to a truth finally unveiled. In the middle of this euphoric chaos, Briggs sat in another room watching the broadcast. The screen showed Alicia in her red suit holding the badge high, her calm and proud smile unshaken. The glow of the screen cast onto his face, highlighting his lifeless pallor. Briggs sat rigid, his broad shoulders trembling slightly, as if bracing against a violent wind. His mouth parted, but made no sound. His eyes widened and drifted, stripped of the arrogance that once carried him through courtrooms. His former authority dissolved completely, replaced by a pale, crumpled face, drowning in the fear of exposure. In that moment, Briggs felt severed from the world, sitting alone between four cold walls, surrounded by cheers echoing from the screen, but none of it belonged to him. Where the gold badge had once shielded and commanded, now the badge in Alicia's hand weighed down like a verdict too heavy to bear. His hands rested on the table, ice-cold and slick with sweat, eyes locked onto Alicia's image like a man hypnotized traumatized, seething, yet helpless. He knew that from this moment on everything had spun beyond his grasp, and every word he'd spoken before was now nothing but ashes. The hall continued to erupt, each clap and cheer rolling in like crashing waves. Some people climbed onto their chairs to record the historic moment, while reporters shouted Alicia's name, begging for a follow-up statement. But she remained calm, standing still with only a smile that asserted her strength without needing any further explanation. On social media, the live stream capturing the eruption inside the hall spread like wildfire, with millions of comments flooding in within minutes, all praising the moment the truth was revealed. While society trembled under the weight of a newfound belief, Briggs sat frozen like a statue. He was no longer the man who shouted others into silence, but a stripped-down figure of failure. His face, pale eyes, vacant body stiffened under the force of truth. And in that moment, everyone understood the game was over. Justice had chosen Alicia, and Briggs had crumbled entirely in the very darkness he created. The next morning, flags waved across the square in front of City Hall. The ceremonial band stood in formation, and solemn melodies echoed through the open air. The sky was clear, the early sunlight casting a golden hue over the grandstand built for the formal inauguration. On the honorary seats sat high-ranking officials in neat rows, while thousands of citizens packed behind them to witness the historic moment firsthand. On the stage, Alicia stepped onto the raised platform, her posture, steady eyes, bright, each of her steps pressed into the silent space, creating an atmosphere of absolute reverence. The ceremony host invited Alicia to approach the wooden podium where a carefully preserved copy of the Constitution rested. She placed her right hand on the firm leather cover, her fingertips brushing over the embossed letters as if touching the heart of an entire nation. The murmurs died down, replaced by a breathless silence. She drew in a deep breath, then spoke firmly, her voice ringing clear with each word. "I swear to protect the Constitution, to defend justice, and to serve the people with all my strength and heart." Her vow echoed across the square, reaching every ear, bringing tears to more than a few eyes. The moment Alicia's hand rested on the Constitution was captured by dozens of television lenses, broadcast live. In millions of homes, families gathered around screens holding their breath. A young mother cradled her baby, whispering softly, "Remember this moment." An elderly veteran stood in his living room, hand over heart, eyes glistening, as he saw a reflection of those who once fought for truth. Students erupted with joy in lecture halls, many overcome with emotion. A whole nation seemed to converge in that single moment, united by the oath being spoken aloud. Cheers then rose like crashing waves, flags soared, applause thundered without end. Alicia kept her hand on the Constitution for a moment longer, affirming that this vow was not just ceremonial but a promise etched deep in her heart. When she let go, her eyes scanned the crowd and a gentle smile appeared behind it, an unwavering resolve. The camera zoomed in, capturing the instant, then beamed it across the world as a clear message: a new chapter had begun. On this inauguration day, it wasn't just oaths that were spoken, but belief that was reborn. People felt justice no longer lived in the distance but stood right before them in the image of a woman who had once been a victim, now a leader. Millions, whether watching from screens or standing in the square, understood that from this day forward trust had been returned to someone worthy. And as the roaring applause carried on, Alicia stepped down from the podium, bearing a new responsibility on her shoulders, along with a vow now echoing in the hearts of millions to protect justice no matter what. As soon as Alicia finished her oath, the square, silent in that sacred moment, erupted into a wave of sound. From thousands of voices, a single chant rose in unison, crashing into the clear blue sky. Justice served. The call echoed rhythmically and powerfully, reverberating through city blocks, bouncing off tall buildings, shaking the very air. In the hands of the people, signs were raised high, flags waved proudly, applause blended seamlessly with the chant, forming a victorious anthem. It was more than a declaration that justice had been served. It was a thank you, a tribute to the woman who had turned faith into reality. That roar didn't stop at the square. Through television broadcasts and millions of live streaming phones, justice served quickly became a phrase flooding every corner of social media. People posted it as status updates, turned it into profile icons, looped it into remix tracks, and sparked a movement of unprecedented scale. Children shouted it while playing in parks. Students drummed it out on classroom desks, and elderly viewers nodded slowly in front of screens, their lips quietly mouthing the words spreading everywhere. Justice had become a living presence with a voice, a pulse, and a breath, bringing everyone together in a shared belief. In stark contrast to the joy outside, Briggs sat alone in an isolated room watching the ceremony on a small screen. The image of Alicia raising her hand in oath, then smiling as the crowd chanted in unison, cut into the remnants of his shattered pride like a blade. Briggs sat still, his eyes lifeless, his face pale. He felt himself swept away from the flow of history, pushed to the margins as a new chapter was being written without him. The gold badge that once symbolized pride was now just a cold piece of metal, a reminder of betrayal, and his name was increasingly spoken with contempt, like a remnant of a dark era. Briggs wasn't forgotten because people had stopped remembering, but because his existence now only served as a symbol of defeat. The press wrote that he had destroyed his own career. Editorials labeled him the antithesis of justice, and in everyday conversations the name Briggs became a warning, a case study in downfall by arrogance. Meanwhile, Alicia was etched into collective memory as a symbol of strength and resilience. The contrast could not be clearer, one lifted as a role model, the other erased from memory, like a smeared page no longer worth reading. And so, as the chant, "Justice Served," continued to echo everywhere, Briggs was officially erased from history as the defeated. No excuse could redeem him now. No position left to cling to everything he had left behind was shame. While the crowd outside celebrated a new beginning, Briggs sat quietly in the shadows watching his name fade into oblivion like ashes blown away by the wind. In a large lecture hall of the law department, light streamed down onto rows of neatly aligned wooden desks where hundreds of students crowded in with open notebooks. The usually lively class suddenly turned serious as the professor entered holding a remote and projecting the video that had shaken the entire society onto the big screen. The footage clearly showed the moment Briggs stepped down from the witness stand, eyes fierce, then the kick he landed on Alicia in the courtroom. Next, Alicia stood firm, turned, and struck back with a punch so decisive that the entire room had erupted. The slow-motion replay highlighted each detail, every movement serving as a vivid illustration of justice, power, and resistance. The students watched in silence, some pressing their lips together, some scribbling notes, others simply clenching their fists to hold back emotion. When the video ended, a wave of murmurs swept through the room. A student in the front row, face lit up with excitement, blurted out, "One kick shook the whole system." The class responded with a mix of laughter and nods, some repeating the line as if affirming a truth. The professor smiled, emphasizing that what seemed like a small act in the middle of a hearing had the power to awaken an entire society. He added that justice doesn't only live in books, but is measured by how a community responds to obvious wrongdoing. In this case, that response began the moment the punch delivered the truth back to everyone. The students quickly launched into debate. Some analyzed the extent and limits of police authority, arguing that Briggs had abused his power to the point of lawlessness, believing his uniform to be an untouchable shield. Others focused on Alicia's silence afterward, observing that her decision not to speak right away made her image all the more powerful. A female student in the middle row said the real lesson wasn't just legal, it was about courage. Because when one person dares to stand up, millions gain the confidence to do the same. Hands kept shooting up, words poured out, and the classroom turned into an open forum reflecting the pulse of society. The professor listened, then concluded with a line that brought the room to stillness. Justice is not a gift handed down, it's preserved with the blood, sweat, and resolve of people like Alicia. He stressed that without her act of defiance, Briggs's kick might have passed as another incident swept under the rug. But because of her resistance, the system had been forced to face the truth. The students sat quietly, clearly aware that today's lesson was no longer just on paper, but alive in the real world where they would be the ones to carry the torch of justice forward. The class ended in a wave of energy with groups of students still debating as they spilled into the hallway. The phrase, "one kick," shook the whole system, echoed everywhere like a new slogan for a generation learning to confront the truth. And from that lecture hall, the lesson about Alicia would continue to be retold as proof that justice only holds meaning when upheld by people who stand for it and pass it on to future generations. Amid the vibrant discussion, a female student seated in the back quietly raised her hand. She didn't speak right away. Instead, took a deep breath, her eyes lighting up as she was invited to share. Her voice trembled slightly but remained firm. "From today, I want to become a human rights lawyer." The class fell silent, then suddenly erupted in applause because her words weren't just a personal dream, they reflected the surge of emotions everyone was feeling. She went on to say that Alicia had planted in her the belief that one person, through courage and integrity, could shake an entire system. Her eyes shone with a powerful conviction that she too could be part of that journey, even if she was just a student for now. The professor smiled, a flicker of pride in his eyes, and said that her dream was exactly the kind of purpose law students should strive for. He emphasized that justice is not a dry theory on paper, but something preserved by generations willing to rise and take action. Her statement added fuel to the fire already burning in the students' hearts. Many eyes turned toward her with admiration, and more than a few quietly wondered if they too would find that same courage when faced with injustice. The atmosphere in the classroom had changed. It was no longer a typical lecture, but an unspoken, oath-taking ceremony for a new set of ideals. As the session closed, the professor announced that from now on, Alicia's story would be included in the official curriculum as a living case study. He said no lengthy explanations of procedure or statutes were needed. Just the video, the evidence, and the public's response were enough to demonstrate how justice comes alive. Students would no longer be studying distant court cases and textbooks, but would be examining a real event from their own time where the line between power and truth had been pushed to its limits. The class fell quiet, aware of the weight of that decision, knowing they were witnessing something that would be cited for years to come as a defining example. Outside the hallway, students gathered in small groups talking nonstop. Many admitted that from now on, when they think of the law, they won't just picture textbooks, but also the image of Alicia standing tall in the courtroom. The story had moved beyond the confines of a legal event to become an educational symbol, inspiring a younger generation to understand that justice is not something distant. And as that living case study was officially brought into the curriculum, it would not only teach students knowledge, but also plant in them the belief that each person holds a responsibility to uphold the truth with words, with actions, and with the choices they make in life. The next morning, across newsstands, big and small, front-page headlines all printed the bold line, "From victim to leader." Alicia's image in a red suit, hand raised high H, holding the gleaming badge, appeared striking under the flash of dozens of cameras. Her face, magnified with steady eyes and a calm yet proud smile, became the symbol of an unprecedented turning point. Major newspapers commented that Alicia's story was no longer just a police scandal, but a historical milestone where justice had been proven through one person's resistance and resilience. Commentators called it the rebirth of trust, a trust once shaken by abuse of power, now rebuilt by the strength of truth. National media dedicated entire segments unpacking the significance of the event. One editorial stated that Alicia sitting in the chief's chair meant far more than an administrative role, that it affirmed how the system could truly change when a leader chose justice over privilege. Another headline read, "Justice has a new face," insisting that her image would be etched into the public memory as a reminder that injustice cannot last forever. Evening broadcasts replayed the press conference footage interspersed with commentary from scholars, human rights activists, and everyday citizens, all echoing the same conclusion: Alicia had become the most powerful symbol of reform in decades. In public forums, speakers emphasized that Alicia's path wasn't just personal advancement, but proof that communities can pressure entire systems to change. From a woman humiliated in a courtroom, Alicia had turned pain into power, silence into a resonant voice. Young people saw her as a role model, believing their small voices could also drive massive change. Human rights organizations called Alicia the Trailblazer, crediting her presence with forcing policy changes, challenging entrenched norms, and compelling powerful figures to reassess their conduct. The headlines, the TV commentaries, the public praise all helped cement Alicia's image as a living legacy of justice. Her presence was no longer limited to the city where the incident occurred, but had spread nationwide and beyond borders to become a global story. And through every article, every broadcast, every retelling, the public came to realize they were witnessing not just the fall of one abusive figure, but the birth of a new era, one where justice would be led by those who refused to bow before injustice. Right after the inauguration, concrete changes began to emerge, and the entire society closely followed Alicia's every move. She didn't allow the title of police chief to remain just a symbol, but swiftly turned it into a foundation for sweeping reform. A series of new policies was enacted emphasizing independent oversight of police conduct, mandatory video recording of all interactions with civilians, and the establishment of mechanisms for citizens to report misconduct directly without fear of retaliation. These rules forced many officers long accustomed to leniency to adjust their behavior gradually, reestablishing discipline and ushering in an era where power no longer stood above the law. Human rights advocates hailed it as an unprecedented overhaul, a declaration that justice must be protected from its very roots. Alicia didn't stop at oversight procedures. She also laid the groundwork for anti-bias education programs throughout the force. Officers were required to attend specialized training courses where they learned about equality, human rights, and social responsibility. On media outlets, footage of these new training classes aired widely, moving many viewers who saw uniformed officers sitting silently, listening to instructors speak about human dignity. These reforms weren't meant to punish anyone, but to end a destructive cycle that had lasted too long. Citizens began to feel a renewed sense of trust, a belief that their voices could truly influence a system that once felt sealed off. As the entire system moved with this new momentum, Briggs was gradually erased from the official record. Internal files removed his name from the list of decorated officers, police ceremonies no longer mentioned him, and his images were taken down from the department's website. He faded into a shadow in public memory, referenced only as a stain and a warning. When the media revisited the story, they portrayed Briggs as the embodiment of power gone wrong, a figure drowned by the force of truth. In classrooms, law students studied Alicia as a symbol of reform, while Briggs remained only as a negative example of what happens when a police officer sees himself as untouchable. That contrast only amplified the legacy Alicia was building. On one side were new policies aimed at fairness, on the other the forgotten figure wrapped in public disdain. People mentioned Briggs as they would a cautionary tale, a reminder that justice can be distorted if left unguarded, but they also recognized recognized that from his downfall a new chapter had been written, and through each reform, Alicia made it clear that the dark past would remain only as a lesson, while the future must be built on trust and transparency. With that resolve, she didn't just transform a system, she erased the stain left by the man who once defiled it. On her first morning in the new office, sunlight streamed through the wide glass window, shining directly onto the polished wooden desk where the police chief's badge rested neatly like a beacon. Alicia stepped inside the leadership chair, still carried the scent of fresh wood, but already bore the weight of responsibility. The room was quiet, filled only with the ticking of the wall clock, yet within that space one could feel the solemnity, as if every brick, every wall, knew a new chapter in history was being written. Alicia sat down. Her hand gently touched the badge. Its cold surface ran along her fingertips, only to be warmed instantly by the heat from her own heart. In that moment, the memory of the courtroom kick came flooding back. Briggs, lunging with the fierce glare, the gasps of panic, the judge's gavel pounding, and the cheers that erupted with her punch. It all replayed like a fast-forward reel in her mind. But, unlike the pain it once brought today, as she recalled it, Alicia smiled. It wasn't a triumphant smile, but the smile of someone who knew every wound had turned into strength. She whispered, her voice soft, yet resolute, a message for herself and the world. No kick can kill justice. Outside the window, the city buzzed as always, crowds moving through sunlit street. In the square, banners with the word justice still hung. Small groups gathered to retell the story like a modern legend. On television, news channels continued airing reports on the latest reforms, and across social media, the image of Alicia in the police chief's chair had become a symbol of transformation. The story didn't end in court, didn't close with the verdict, but lived on in every conversation, every classroom lesson, every policy decision now taking shape. Alicia understood she was standing at a crossroads between past and future. Behind her lay the darkness of humiliation, the scar still faintly etched on her wrist, the pain inflicted by Briggs and the old system. Ahead of her stretched a long road full of obstacles, but also filled with chances to turn chance into reality. On her desk were stacked drafts of new policies, reform files, and letters sent by citizens. Each page was a message, a hope, a responsibility that left no room for hesitation. In that room, light reflected off the badge on the desk, shimmering like a guiding lamp. Alicia knew that from now on, justice was no longer a distant idea, but a daily responsibility tied to every decision and every action she and the team she led would take. The conclusion of the story about Briggs's kick was the beginning of a new journey, one where justice no longer rested in the hands of the abusive, but belonged to everyone. And from the moment Alicia smiled in the police chief's office, society understood that a dark chapter had closed, making way for a new era, one where justice is written in light trust and the determination of those who dare to stand tall. As she sat silently in the chief's chair, Alicia let her hand rest on the badge's cold surface, the morning light making it gleam like a small star. She closed her eyes, letting memories flood back from the handcuffs once digging into her wrists to the mocking laughter, Briggs's shouting in court, and the roaring chants from the square. It all overlapped like tangled film reels, but in the end, what remained was not the kicks, the insults, or the storm of outrage, but the raw truth that had been exposed and defended. She understood clearly that justice didn't live in a uniform, wasn't measured by rank or a badge, but only existed when someone dared to stand up and speak the truth, even in moments of humiliation. This morning's oath was just the beginning of a long road where she would have to turn those values into daily action so that no one else would have to stand alone in the dark as she once did. Across the country, talk of Alicia was non-stop. The press called her the woman who gave justice back its meaning, while on social media post after post quoted her words like a new truth. In classrooms, teachers brought her story into their lessons, turning it into a vivid example of the power of truth. Children wrote justice for Alicia on blackboards, not to glorify a person, but to remind each other that honest voices matter. The reforms gradually became part of daily life, each one bearing the mark of that punch. People saw officers wearing body cameras, saw public meetings held more transparently, saw complaint letters answered, and they knew that justice had been given a new chance to live. As for Briggs, his name was erased from records like a stain unworthy of remembrance, a leftover from a mistaken past. He no longer appeared in the media, no longer held the fear or respect of his former colleagues, and was remembered only with disdain. Yet, his downfall only made Alicia's lesson clearer that justice cannot be twisted by anyone who believes they are above the law. His story wasn't preserved to stir hatred, but to serve as a warning for future generations, a reminder that all power must answer to the truth. And so, as the morning sun rose higher and golden light poured across the room, Alicia sat quietly, a gentle smile on her lips. She didn't need many words because her presence alone had already proven everything. The story seemed to end with the sentencing of an abuser of power, but in truth it marked the beginning of something new. It was the beginning of a belief, of a movement of generations being raised with a clear lesson. Justice doesn't lie in a uniform but in the truth, and the flame lit from that moment would keep burning through every classroom, every street, every heart, illuminating a future where truth and fairness can never be extinguished. The story closed in the light of a new morning with Alicia seated firmly in the chief's chair, yet the echoes of the journey still resonated in the hearts of millions. What began as a courtroom session that seemed procedural erupted into a reckoning that shattered a system long shielded by arrogance and bias. The woman once scorned and humiliated turned that painful moment into the foundation for the collapse of an old regime where power had been used to suppress rather than protect. Alicia's initial silence, instead of dimming her presence, made her image shine brighter, sparking widespread curiosity that soon ignited an unprecedented wave of unity. The days that followed were marked by a storm across social media, television, and peaceful protests where chants of justice for Alicia echoed like a shared anthem. Briggs's lies were exposed one by one, irrefutable footage from security cameras slicing through every excuse. The public watched in suspense, then stood stunned as the truth was finally revealed when Alicia held up her badge and declared herself the new police chief. That moment didn't just erupt in the courtroom. It shook the nation's collective faith. Briggs, once a man who believed he embodied the law, was erased from history as a stain, while Alicia rose as a living symbol of transformation. But the greatest meaning of the story wasn't the fall of one man, but the rebirth of trust. When Alicia placed her hand on the Constitution and vowed to protect justice with all her heart, the millions watching no longer saw her as a surprised witness, but as a guiding light. The reforms enacted, the human rights classes launched, and the independent oversight mechanisms established all proved that justice was not a slogan, but a set of concrete action. People began to feel that their voices were no longer meaningless, that their outrage could become the power to force a system to change. In lecture halls, Alicia became a living syllabus. Professors no longer lectured only on distant cases from textbooks, but played the video that had shaken an entire society. Young students engaged in lively discussions, many find an inspiration in that story to pursue the path of fighting for justice. One female student said she wanted to become a human rights lawyer, and at that moment the whole class applauded, taking it as proof that a new generation had received the flame passed down from Alicia. Conversations in families on the streets and in community meetings all revolved around this lesson, and it no longer belonged to just one city, but had spread into a spiritual legacy for generations to come. Looking back on the entire journey, what remains is not a punch or a kick, but the message lit by them. Justice is not defined by a uniform, nor is it a privilege held by a few, but shaped by truth, by the courage of those who dare to stand when everyone else wants them silent. Alicia proved that one person can spark an entire new era by turning pain into action, silence into voice, and contempt into strength. This story ends with a new title, but begins a longer journey where justice is no longer a theory, but blood, sweat, and belief passed from one generation to the next. And, in the light reflecting from the gleaming badge on Alicia's desk, people understood that the flame had been passed on to light up the tomorrows no longer hidden in darkness.